Hi, welcome to Let's Talk About Sex, Really. I'm your host, Dr. Alisa Kriegel. And today's topic is let's talk about a new definition of sex. Um, I came to this topic after several events happened during this week, and I'll get into some of those. But starting off, really, where I want to go with this is this idea that we have sort of one really very narrow, very specific definition of what most people mean when they say the word sex. And usually, what is meant is heterosexual sex, intercourse, um, penis and vagina. I will talk about it as P and V because it's easier, quicker. You might read that or hear that, especially in people who have more of a sex positive way of talking about things. And to get very specific, that the reason for this and the reason I'm giving it this very specific way of talking about it is because that is one type of sex. But we have all been, most of us, raised with this idea that, right, this was the big act. This was, if we're going around the bases, as we used to talk about, right, this is the home run. This is how we lost our virginity. This is where, like, you're doing everything but. Uh, like, this is when Bill Clinton talked about not having sexual relations with that woman. It was because he was being too cute by half. Clearly, in that moment or whatever act he was talking about, he didn't feel because his penis wasn't in her vagina, it didn't count. Like, we have to stop. This is too much. And we need to get specific because here's the other piece. Politics aside, what we learn aside, what I see happening again and again is that having this very narrow definition affects our behavior, affects your behavior. So when we define something, we are basically defining what are the behaviors that we need to have, or what are the behaviors, what are the actions that create that definition. By having a very narrow focus on what sex is, it limits us in terms of what behaviors are just more organic, more natural. So let me give you the first example of kind of what came up for me this week that I heard and kind of got a little bell going in my head. Is I had a client who is having pelvic pain and was found to have a cyst or something in her ovaries or uterus. And it was causing a great deal of pain. And her gynecologist told her to stay away from any intense activities and sex. And when she was telling me about this, she was a little bit confused, as was I, because we didn't know if it was okay for her to have other kinds of sexual engagement, whether oral sex was off the table. Was the issue not having anything in her vagina, that there was some concern about pain or cyst, or was the issue not having an orgasm, that she was, even that could be painful, and she didn't know, and it made her concerned. And I thought, this is a gynecologist who deals regularly with sex, with vaginas, and didn't have the language to be more specific. By her saying sex, it was assumed that that was understood. And it's not, because there are so many ways to have sex. And that's really what we are talking about today, is, can we broaden this definition of sex? Because if we do, then we have more understanding, more options. So in the case of this, if the doctor had said specifically what sex she could engage in safely and what was okay for her to do, she would have had so much more clarity. And instead of being anxious and worried to do anything, she would have known very specifically what exactly she could do and what was the issue. Was it orgasm? Was it something penetrating her? So that is really important. The other thing that this brings up is the idea that we still have a very old-fashioned patriarchal view of sex, of intercourse is sex. And so I've seen this with so many of my clients, especially the young women I work with, that there was this assumption that if they were going to hook up with someone, it was for intercourse. And sometimes there might be other acts. Oftentimes, if there was some moral sex, it was really more just as a quick precursor to the real act, the big act, what sex is. And that really changes. And so for a lot of these young women, they felt several things. They felt uncomfortable. I had one young woman who really never felt pleasure during sex because sex was so narrowly defined and so narrowly experienced by her. So she had the sense, and this is someone who grew up um, in New York City with fairly progressive ideas about most things, but sex wasn't really talked about except in this way that there was an expectation that you have sex. And pleasure wasn't talked about. So when we have this limited definition of sex as penetration or sex as intercourse, what we are also limiting is the idea that sex is pleasurable for everyone and that intercourse, penetration may not be the way that some women find pleasure. Some do. And I mean, I am not dissing on penetration and intercourse and all of it, but I think it is part of a greater, fuller, more broad, pleasurable system, which is that sex is anytime you can be physical, sexual, a naked body with a naked body or a partially naked body, or even just having sensual touch and exploration is sex. So when we limit this, it becomes very one-sided. And what am I talking about? So it makes me think about this research that's been around for a while on something called the orgasm gap. I actually did a podcast a while back. You can find it on alisakriegel.com or anywhere where you listen to my podcasts. It is called Let's Talk About Closing the Orgasm Gap. So if you're interested in more, but the basic idea behind it is that in years of research, what has been found is that in heterosexual sex, men orgasm significantly greater amounts than women. I think there was, New York Times did an article in 2024 how the orgasm gap has not really changed even as women age. It doesn't get better. Um, in 2022, the most I saw was a survey in which men reported almost always orgasming during sex 95% of the time. Women reported almost always orgasming 25% of the time. Significant difference. So when we are talking about one type of sex in this way, then that gap is really large, as opposed to talking about it in different ways. So someone, very well-known, wonderful sex therapist, his name is Dr. Ian Kerner. He had a book several years ago called She Comes First. And in She Comes First, he's basically talking about the importance of oral sex and clitoral stimulation for women. So he coined the term. What he realized is it was just so important for really good sex that, and by good, I mean where people both feel pleasure. Um, he coined the term outer course in relation to, instead of everything being about intercourse, he decided, let's sort of, right, again, redefine what terms we're using. So let's talk about outer course. Let's focus on the outside. I know a lot of men as well who really enjoy oral sex, or giving and receiving, or just being stroked, or all the any touch that's not just going right to one thing. So what what happens is, because we have this outdated narrative, I've seen people feel pressure in terms of this act of sex and almost feel like they're not doing something right, or that sex isn't good unless, I mean, this is really what it is. The idea of looking at it is, you get turned on, you have desire, you fuck by having a penis in the vagina and penetration, and both people should have an orgasm, and that's good sex. And that's not what happens. As we see, if only 25% of women are having orgasms during sex. The other thing that happens is, because that is a very set narrative that most of us have seen and heard and grown up with and talk about and see in movies and the whole thing, it creates, I've seen a sort of pressure that this is what people have to do. So my client who was having pelvic pain was feeling really anxious that she would be seeing her boyfriend and not being able to have penetration, which meant there would be some sort of disappointment if they couldn't have sex. And so we had to look at different ways that you can have pleasure, and look at, right, how could they explore? And her boyfriend has a very limited view of this. So if it's not, a blowjob that she usually, he, has difficulty, the two of them have difficulty having a blowjob come to be how he finishes. And so he usually finishes through penetration. And if that's off the table, then she felt that there was nothing they could do, because she didn't want to start something that she couldn't finish, or that he couldn't finish, so to speak. So we had to talk about different ways that this could be accomplished and explored. And different ways to find pleasure. And because there was such this rigid idea that that's not sex and he won't be happy, it really limited the imagination of all the things that could be explored. So some of the things that we explored and that she will now have to bring back to her boyfriend to explore, and that's what this is all about, is even if one of you can broaden the definitions and how sex could be, how do you then talk about it with another partner, right? So one of the things we talked about is talking about pleasure, that she wants to be able to have her partner experience pleasure, and that she wants to do it in a way that doesn't cause her distress and pain. Because what happens, and I've seen a lot of women who've gone through sex feeling uncomfortable and feeling pain and assuming that's just what it is. And then what happens is that's where we get resentment. And that's where people start feeling like, well, this isn't fun. I don't want to do this, or this is going to cause me distress. And then sex starts becoming less and less. And so, really, what we're looking at is, look, I really like Emily Nagoski talks about a few things. She's a sex educator who has several books, and I'll put the links. Her newest is Come Together. People like putting come in the title of books about sex. That's a whole other pet peeve of mine, but I get it. Sells books, Come Together. Ian Kerner's book is called She Comes First, which makes sense because that's what's happening with oral sex. But I will put the links to both books. But Emily Nagoski talks about that we have sex. We have more sex when it's sex that we want to have. If you are enjoying the sex you're having, you are going to want more. If you are feeling physical pain or resentment or pressure or anxiety during the course of sex, honestly, you're not going to want to keep having sex as much. So part of the conversation then would look something like, I want to give you pleasure, but I don't want to have my own discomfort or resentments if I start something and I can't give you a blowjob as long as you need for you to be able to finish that way. So, can we explore, since intercourse is off the table right now, can we explore some new ways of doing things? Right. And some of the things we talked about together were, what if he finishes himself? And what she said is he doesn't like to touch himself in front of her or jerk off in front of her. Well, that's too bad, because that's something that if we could expand this definition of what sex and pleasure is, then people could see that's not just something maybe that's done in private or done because you can't have intercourse. It can be a whole way of connecting with your partner. There is something that a lot of people engage in and really enjoy called mutual masturbation, where both partners masturbate next to each other or holding each other or one at a time. And it can be really intimate because you're sharing something with your partner of how you pleasure yourself in private and you're allowing your partner to see that. So it can actually be really vulnerable, in some ways, more vulnerable than penetration, because you're being seen in a very different way. Um, she could watch him finish while she's holding him or stroking him or touching his balls or licking him or any number. And this is what I'm trying to say is, when we brought in the definition, we brought in the possibilities. So if we start looking at sex as not just this one act, one discrete act, that ends in orgasm, but that it is about pleasure, that maybe there's an orgasm at the end, maybe there's not. And maybe if the orgasm is important, there's creative and new ways to get there that aren't just this one way that may or may not work for both people. So what I've seen is that the limits and the rigidity of sex being just intercourse. That's what we think of. And everything else is just a quick foreplay to get you to that. What ends up happening is it often creates more pressure for both parties, for the man to feel like he's pleasuring the woman, which leads to lots of faked orgasm. The number of clients, of female clients I have worked with who have shared after years of being in long-term relationships or marriages or with the same partner who have shared that they have never orgasmed and never told their partner and have been faking it. I, too many to count. And that's really sad because that means that they're missing out on exploring with their partner what actually feels good. And they're giving their partner a sense that whatever he's doing is working. And it's not. And that's not an insult to someone. That's an opportunity to try new things. And not having that opportunity puts pressure on, we have to get this done. And what I've seen happen is we are creating situations with more pressure than pleasure. And we don't want the pressure. We want the pleasure. We want to optimize that. So by broadening this definition, by opening our minds to all the ways that what we are doing is sex, is connection, is pleasure, then we have more opportunities to connect with our partner. And that's really what this is about: pleasure, connection, um, feeling good in our bodies, feeling freedom in our bodies, right? So, that's the other piece. And that's something that happened. That was the other thing, the final thing that happened this week that made me think of this was something for myself, actually, getting uh, personal, which is what this is all about, because part of this is just like we are all, if you're listening, it's because you are having sex, you're wanting to have sex, you're talking about, we are all human, we are sexual creatures, we are sexual beings, sex is healthy, sex is positive. And I was in a situation, morning sex, which is sometimes great. And sometimes I'm kind of just not fully awake or I'm stressed about the day. And my partner, my boyfriend was, we were engaging, he was giving me oral and I just was close, but I wasn't going to come. I wasn't going to have an orgasm. And I said so. And I was like, I don't think I'm going to get there. And this is awesome. And it feels really great. But I'm starting to feel this pressure and it's not happening. And I'm feeling bad. And for everything I know, I still was like, oh, yeah, I still fall back into, during times of anxiety, during times of stress, we all fall back to what is the most deeply embedded belief system we have, the earliest way of doing things. And my earliest way of doing things is still, oh, I'm supposed to be, I'm supposed to have an orgasm and that will be the end and that will feel good and that will make him feel good and da 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 down the line. And he was awesome, which is why I'm with him. He was really awesome. And he was like, sex doesn't always have to be about orgasm. And it's like I've only said that a couple of hundred times to clients and on this podcast, but in that moment, in my own stressed mind, I kind of forgot just for a second. And it's really nice to be reminded. And sometimes we all need that. Sometimes we all need to be reminded, like, oh, hey, we're falling back, or just something nice, or it's great. Like what he says, I love doing this. um, I love licking you. I love being with you. And the orgasm's like the icing on the cake. If it happens, it happens. But it's just the being together, and it's the pleasure, and it's the closeness and all of it. And that's where I want that's where I want the world to get to. And that's a bigger issue. That's where I want sex education to get to, and narratives, so that we can all, and doctors talking about sex in very specific ways of what you can, which acts they're talking about, and not just this general, like, patriarchal sex, and we are supposed to know what that means. So that's really what I want. It's how to keep reminding ourselves that sex is so much more than just intercourse, and so much more than just having an orgasm, and so much more than just this narrow, limited idea of what it's supposed to be. And so I encourage all of you to start looking at, what are you considering sex? What are the behaviors that you engage in? What is your way of having sex? And look, what's wonderful is I think there is so much more um, acceptance out there. But look in your own bedroom, look behind your own door, and see where are the places that you might still be falling into this trap of a more limited set of behaviors, a more limited understanding of what you and your partner consider to be sex. And just start having that conversation about wanting to have more pleasure and more options, and try new things, and see this all as close and connecting, and wanting to give each other pleasure, and having, Emily Nagoski says, just get naked and get your body skin on skin and see what happens, because that is all sex. That is all connection. That is all pleasure. And what you want to do with that is so much broader and has so many more possibilities than we have been raised to believe. So I will put links in my podcast notes. Take a look at Ian Kerner or Emily Nagoski. Take a look at my previous podcast on Let's Talk About Closing the Orgasm Gap. Um, have the hard conversations. Look at the hard things in yourself. Look at the challenge yourself to broaden the definitions. Talk about it. You don't have to go on air. You don't have to talk about it to hundreds of people, thousands of people. Just talk about it to the one person that matters. And that's what inspired me. Is I had someone who said just the right thing at just the right moment. And sometimes that's all you need. So practice that, and have fun while you're practicing. And there is no right or wrong way. Does it feel pleasurable? Does it feel good to you? Does it feel good to the two of you? But be open about that. So, love being here talking to you. If you would like to follow me, please, if you're watching this on video, please follow my YouTube. I am on Instagram at Let's Talk About Sex Really, or Let's Talk About Sex _ really. And my website is alisakriegel.com. So take a look at that, and I will be back next week. Who knows what topic will inspire me then? If you have questions, if you have issues that are coming up, feel free to send me a DM on my Instagram. I love getting questions. I will try to incorporate them or create a podcast that answers your question or bring it up in a podcast. So definitely reach out. Follow me on Instagram. Send me a DM if you'd like. That would be great. And I look forward to more next time. And in the meantime, just enjoy yourself, enjoy each other, enjoy pleasure. Take care. Bye.